The knife was already at her throat when Elara realized she had walked into the wrong tent. She had only come to deliver a mended cloak to one of the pack guards, the kind of small errand she performed 100 times a year without anyone looking at her twice. But the guard who grabbed her wrist was not the one she expected, and the voice that hissed into her ear was low, sharp, and full of threat. "Take off the veil," he said. "Let me see who sends letters to the border camps." Elara's heart slammed against her ribs. Nobody was supposed to know about the letters. Nobody was supposed to know about anything. For 3 years she had built a life around being unseen, around being the quiet seamstress nobody bothered to look at twice. And now, in the space of a single evening, a stranger with a blade had found the one secret that could unravel everything. "I do not know what you are talking about," she said, keeping her voice steady, even as her pulse roared in her ears. The man's grip tightened. "The Alpha King's men found parchment near the eastern ridge. Same handwriting as yours. Same ink you buy from the merchant on Willow Street. You think nobody watches a woman who never shows her face?" Behind the veil, Elara's eyes burned, not with tears, but with fury at herself. 3 years of careful silence, and one careless evening had nearly cost her everything. She twisted her wrist free with a strength that surprised even her, driven by pure instinct, and shoved past the guard's shoulder before he could recover. She did not run toward the main square, where torches burned and eyes would follow her. She ran the other way, through the narrow alley behind the tanner's shop, past the well, into the shadow of the old stone wall that marked the edge of the servants' quarter. Only when her lungs burned and her legs shook did she stop, pressing her back against the cold stone, listening for footsteps that never came. The guard had not followed. Perhaps he had orders to only frighten her, to test how she would react. Perhaps he simply lost her in the dark. Either way, one truth remained clear and terrifying. Someone in the palace was asking questions about her. And if those questions reached the wrong ears, the veil she had worn every single day for 3 years would no longer be enough to protect her. She waited until her breathing calmed, before she allowed herself to think clearly. She was Elara, the seamstress of the lower quarter, known to the pack only by the plain gray cloth that covered the lower half of her face from her nose to her collarbone, tied neatly behind her head, never removed in public, not once, not even during the hottest days of summer when sweat soaked through the fabric and made her skin itch unbearably. The pack had grown so used to her by now that most did not even remark on it anymore. New arrivals sometimes asked why the seamstress hid her face, and the older residents would simply shrug and say, "That is just Elara. She has always been that way," and the conversation would end there. Because in a kingdom ruled by an alpha king, known for his coldness and his unshakable authority, people learned quickly not to ask too many questions about anyone. But someone had been asking questions about her, and that someone worked close enough to the palace to know about letters sent to a border camp that Elara had visited exactly once, 3 years ago, before the veil, before the silence, before she'd buried the woman she used to be, beneath layers of gray cloth and careful habits. She pressed her palm against the stone wall and closed her eyes, forcing herself to remember why she had chosen this life in the first place. 3 years ago, she had loved a man so completely that she believed nothing could break that love. She had been wrong. That man was now the alpha king of this territory, ruling from a palace she could see from her small window every single morning, a constant reminder of everything she had lost and everything she could never have again. His name was Draven, and he did not know she still lived within his own walls. He did not know that the seamstress who mended his guards' uniforms, who stitched the ceremonial robes worn during pack gatherings, who sat quietly in the corner of the market square with her needle and thread, was the same woman he had once held in his arms beneath a summer sky, promising her a future that never came. Elara pushed off from the wall and began walking again, slower this time, forcing her breathing back into a natural rhythm. She could not afford panic. Panic made people careless, and carelessness had already nearly exposed her once tonight. She reached her small home near the edge of the servants' quarter just as the last candle in the window of her neighbor flickered out. Inside, she bolted the door, checked the single window twice, and finally allowed herself to sink onto the narrow bed that had been her only companion for 3 years. She untied the veil for the first time since morning, letting it fall into her lap, and stared at her own reflection in the small cracked mirror propped against the wall. The face that looked back at her was still young, still recognizable if anyone bothered to truly look, though grief and hard years had carved thin lines beside her eyes that had not existed 3 years ago. She remembered the last time Draven had seen this face. She remembered the anger in his eyes, the way his jaw had tightened, as his advisor spoke words she could still hear if she closed her eyes and let herself remember. Words about unworthy bloodlines and unsuitable matches, and the dangers of an alpha king choosing with his heart instead of his duty. She remembered running that night too, just as she had run tonight, except that time she had run from the palace itself, from the man she loved, from a future that had been promised to her, and then torn away in front of the entire pack. She had disappeared for 6 months, before returning under a different name, with a veil covering her face, telling herself it was the only way to survive, in a territory ruled by the very man who had broken her heart. She needed his kingdom's protection, its trade routes, its safety from wandering rogues who preyed on lone travelers. She could not leave, she had nowhere else to go, so she stayed, hidden in plain sight, close enough to see him from a distance, but far enough that he never once looked her way. Until tonight. Until a stranger with a blade had reminded her that secrets, no matter how carefully guarded, had a way of surfacing when least expected. Ilara retied the veil with trembling hands, even though she was alone in her own home, because 3 years of habit had become instinct, and instinct told her that danger was closer now than it had ever been. She did not sleep well that night. Every creak of the wooden floor, every gust of wind against her window, sent her heart racing. By the time the first gray light of dawn crept through the gap in her curtain, she had already decided what she needed to do. She needed to find out who had sent that guard, and why. The market square was already busy when Ilara arrived, merchants calling out prices for fresh bread and river fish, children weaving between stalls, the scent of wood smoke and spice filling the cool morning air. She took her usual seat near the fabric merchant's stall, laid out her needle and thread, and began working on a torn jacket a young guard had brought her the day before, all while her eyes moved carefully across the square, searching faces, searching for anyone who might have been watching her the night before. She did not have to search long. A woman approached her stall with quick, purposeful steps, her expression tight with worry rather than menace. Ilara recognized her immediately as Wren, one of the kitchen maids who occasionally brought her mending, a young woman, with kind eyes, and a habit of talking more than she should. "Ilara," Wren said, keeping her voice low as she leaned over the stall. "You need to hear this before someone else tells you a version that is not true." Ilara's hands stilled over the fabric. "Tell me what?" "There was trouble near the eastern gate last night," Wren said. "One of the king's personal guards was caught roughing up a woman in the servants' quarter. Nobody official is saying much, but the whispers say he was acting on his own, not on the king's orders. Some kind of side business, collecting information to sell to rival packs. The captain of the guard found out and had him arrested before dawn." Relief washed through Ilara so suddenly that she nearly dropped her needle. The guard who attacked her had not been sent by Draven at all. He had been working for himself, or for someone outside the palace entirely, someone willing to pay for information about a seamstress who kept her face hidden. But relief did not last long, because a new fear replaced it almost immediately. If a rogue guard had been digging for information about her, someone outside the palace already suspected something. Someone already wanted to know why Ilara wore a veil, and what she might be hiding beneath it. "Do you know who he was selling information to?" Ilara asked, trying to keep her voice as steady as possible. Wren shook her head. "Nobody knows yet. The captain is questioning him this morning. But Ilara," she added, glancing around before lowering her voice even further, "he had your name written on a scrap of paper, along with a description. Someone specifically wanted to know about you." The words settled over Ilara like a weight pressing down on her chest. She thanked Wren for the warning, promised to be careful, and watched the kitchen maid hurry back toward the palace kitchens before allowing herself to process what she had just learned. Someone wanted information about her specifically. Not about the seamstress in general, not about a random woman in the servants' quarter, but about Ilara, by name, with a description detailed enough to be useful. 3 possibilities ran through her mind as she packed up her sewing supplies with hands that would not quite stop shaking. Either someone from her past life had recognized her despite the veil and wanted to expose her secret for their own gain, or a rival pack, aware of her connection to the Alpha King, hoped to use that connection as leverage in some larger political game she knew nothing about. Or, and this thought frightened her most of all, Draven himself had somehow begun to suspect the truth, and had sent someone to quietly investigate, before confronting her directly. She told herself the third option was impossible. Draven had not looked at her twice in 3 years. He walked past her stall in the market square nearly every week, close enough that she could see the tired lines around his eyes, the weight of ruling a kingdom pressing down on his broad shoulders, and never once had his gaze lingered on the veiled seamstress kneeling over her sewing. But as she made her way home that evening, weaving through the crowded streets with her basket of supplies balanced against her hip, she could not shake the feeling that something had shifted. The air itself seemed different, charged with a tension she could not name, as though the careful world she had built around herself was beginning to crack at the edges. She did not know yet that across the city, inside the palace walls, Alpha King Draven sat alone in his private study, staring at a scrap of parchment recovered from the arrested guard's belongings, reading a name that meant nothing to him, and everything to him at the same time, a name that stirred something buried deep in his memory, that he could not quite reach. Ilara. He said the name aloud, testing the shape of it on his tongue, and felt an inexplicable ache settle in his chest, the kind of ache that came from almost remembering something important, something he had lost long ago and never quite managed to find again. He did not know why the name felt familiar. He did not know why his wolf, usually silent and controlled, stirred restlessly at the sound of it, pacing beneath his skin like an animal catching a scent it recognized but could not place. He only knew that he needed to find this woman, and soon, because something told him the answer to a question he had been asking himself for 3 years, might finally be within reach. Outside his window, the city settled into evening, lanterns flickering to life across rooftops, and somewhere among those quiet streets, a woman in a gray veil walked home, unaware that the very man she had spent 3 years avoiding had just spoken her name for the first time since the night everything between them had shattered. Neither of them slept easily that night. Draven paced his study long after the candles burned low, turning the scrap of parchment over in his hands, trying to place a name that felt like it belonged to a dream he could no longer fully recall. Ilara lay awake in her small bed, listening to every sound outside her window, wondering how much longer her careful world could hold together before the truth finally found its way to the surface. Neither of them could have guessed that the answer to both their restless nights lay only a few streets apart, separated by nothing more than distance, and time, and a piece of gray cloth that had protected a secret for 3 long years, but would not protect it forever. Draven summoned the captain of his guard before the sun had fully risen the next morning, his voice carrying the sharp edge of a man who had not slept. "I want to know everything about the arrested guard," he said, standing at the window of his study, arms crossed over his chest. "Who he worked for, who paid him, and I want to know why he had a woman's name written on a piece of parchment hidden in his boot." The captain, a broad-shouldered wolf named Garrick, who had served the royal family for over a decade, shifted uncomfortably. "My king, the prisoner claims he was collecting information for a merchant from the Northern Territories, someone interested in buying secrets about anyone connected to the palace. He says the woman in question was simply a target because she never shows her face. He thought a woman hiding her identity might be hiding something valuable." "And is she?" Draven asked, turning from the window. "Hiding something valuable?" Garrick hesitated. "I do not know, my king. I have seen her in the market. She is a seamstress, quiet, keeps to herself, never caused trouble in the years she has lived here." "Years," Draven repeated, something tightening in his chest. "How many years?" 3, I believe, perhaps a little longer." 3 years. The number settled over Draven, like a stone dropping into still water, sending ripples through a memory he could not fully grasp. 3 years ago, his entire world had changed. 3 years ago, he had lost something, or someone, though the details remained frustratingly blurred, as though a fog had settled over that particular stretch of his past, and refused to lift no matter how hard he tried to see through it. He remembered fragments. A woman's laughter carried on a summer breeze, the warmth of a hand in his own voice, younger and less guarded, making promises he could not clearly recall the substance of, and then nothing, a sudden absence, a hollow space where memories should have been, as though someone had reached into his mind and carefully removed an entire chapter of his life. He had never told anyone about the gaps in his memory. An alpha king could not afford to appear weak, could not afford to admit that certain months of his past felt like looking through frosted glass, shapes visible but details lost. He had assumed over time that the confusion was simply the result of grief and stress from those difficult early years of his rule, when he had taken the throne earlier than expected after his father's sudden passing, when the pressure of leadership had nearly broken him. But now, staring at a scrap of parchment with a stranger's name written across it, he wondered for the first time if something else entirely had happened 3 years ago, something deliberately hidden from him, something connected to a woman he could not quite remember, but somehow could not stop thinking about. "Bring the prisoner to me," Draven said finally. "I want to question him myself." The interrogation yielded little of use. The guard, a thin, nervous man named Silas, insisted repeatedly that he knew nothing beyond what he had already confessed, that he had simply been paid to gather information about anyone in the territory who seemed unusual or secretive, and the veiled seamstress had caught his attention because of how carefully she guarded her privacy. "Who paid you?" Draven demanded, his voice low and dangerous, the kind of tone that made even seasoned warriors take a step back. "A merchant," Silas stammered. "I never learned his true name. He called himself Callum. He said he worked for interests outside the territory, collecting information for a price. That is all I know. I swear it on my own life." Draven studied the man for a long moment, searching for any sign of deception, but found only genuine fear. Whatever this Callum wanted with information about a veiled seamstress, the answer clearly did not lie with the frightened man kneeling before him. He dismissed the prisoner into the custody of his guards and returned to his study, but he could not shake the restless feeling building inside him. His wolf paced beneath his skin, agitated in a way it had not been in years, as though sensing something important nearby, something worth searching for. He decided, almost against his own better judgment, that he would see this seamstress for himself. He told himself it was a matter of security, nothing more. A stranger interested in secretly gathering information about someone within his territory was a threat that demanded his personal attention, regardless of how insignificant the target might seem. It had nothing to do with the strange, persistent ache that had settled in his chest since he first read her name. He told himself this several times as he made his way through the market square that afternoon, dressed in a plain cloak that hid his royal markings, accompanied only by Garrick, who kept a respectful distance while remaining alert to any sign of danger. He found her exactly where the guards had described, seated near the fabric merchant's stall, bent over a piece of clothing with careful, practiced movements, her face hidden entirely behind a plain gray veil that covered her from the bridge of her nose down to her collarbone. Draven stopped several paces away, and for reasons he could not explain, found himself unable to move any closer. There was something about the way she held herself, the particular angle of her shoulders, the way her hands moved with quiet precision, that struck him as impossibly, achingly familiar, though he could not have said why. His wolf surged forward beneath his skin, straining toward her with an urgency that startled him, as though recognizing something his human mind could not yet name. He forced himself to approach, keeping his expression carefully neutral, though his heart hammered against his ribs in a way that confused him deeply. "Excuse me," he said, stopping just beside her stall. "I am told you are the finest seamstress in this quarter." Alara's hands stilled instantly over the fabric in her lap. She did not need to look up to recognize that voice. She had heard it in her dreams for 3 years, had replayed the memory of it so many times that she could recite every syllable from memory, and now it stood directly beside her, close enough to touch, closer than it had been since the night everything fell apart. She kept her head bowed, forcing her hands to continue their work, despite the violent trembling that threatened to give her away. "I do my best, sir," she said, deliberately roughening her voice, dropping it lower than her natural tone, a trick she had practiced for exactly this kind of moment, though she had never truly believed she would need to use it against him directly. "I have a garment that needs urgent repair," Draven continued, watching her closely, though he could not have explained what exactly he was looking for. "Would you be willing to visit the palace to complete the work?" "I would pay generously for the inconvenience." Every instinct in Alara's body screamed at her to refuse, to invent an excuse, to put as much distance between herself and this man as possible before her carefully constructed disguise crumbled entirely. But refusing the Alpha King's request, especially one delivered so publicly, in the middle of a crowded market square, would draw far more attention than she could afford. "Of course," she said, forcing her voice to remain calm and steady. "I would be honored." "Good," Draven said, and though she could not see his face clearly with her head still bowed, she could hear something shift in his tone, something almost like relief, or perhaps satisfaction, though she could not be certain which. "Come to the palace tomorrow morning. Ask for Garrick at the eastern gate. He will bring you to me directly." He turned and walked away before she could respond further, Garrick following a step behind, and Alara remained frozen in place long after his footsteps faded into the general noise of the market, her needle forgotten in her lap, her heart pounding so violently she feared it might be audible to everyone around her. Tomorrow morning, she would walk into the palace she had avoided for 3 years, and stand before the man whose heart she had once believed belonged to her completely, and somehow find a way to keep her secret hidden from the one person in the entire kingdom who might actually recognize the truth if given even the smallest chance. She did not sleep at all that night, running through every possible outcome, every precaution she might take, every excuse she might use if the veil slipped even slightly. By the time dawn broke over the rooftops of the servants' quarter, she had convinced herself that she could survive one meeting, one carefully controlled interaction, and return home with her secret still intact. She did not yet understand that Draven had already begun to suspect something was different about this particular seamstress, something worth investigating far more carefully than a simple mended garment could ever explain. And she did not yet know that inside the palace walls, preparations were already underway, not for a simple repair, but for a conversation that Draven intended to be far longer, and far more revealing, than anything Alara had prepared herself for. The eastern gate loomed larger than Alara remembered, its iron bars polished to a dull shine, 2 guards standing rigid on either side. She had approached this same gate once before, 3 years ago, wearing a different name and a very different expression, full of hope instead of dread. Now she stood before it again, her basket of sewing supplies clutched tightly against her hip, her veil tied so securely she had checked the knot 4 separate times before leaving her home. "I am here to see Garrick," she said, keeping her voice low and rough, the same disguised tone she had used in the market square. One of the guards nodded and disappeared through the gate, returning moments later with the broad-shouldered captain himself, who studied her briefly before gesturing for her to follow. "The king is expecting you," Garrick said, as they walked through a series of stone corridors, past tapestries depicting the history of the pack, past guards who barely glanced in her direction. "He does not usually take a personal interest in matters this small. You should feel honored." Alara said nothing, focusing instead on keeping her breathing steady, her steps measured, her posture exactly as unremarkable as it had been for 3 years. Every corridor they passed stirred memories she had spent years trying to bury. She remembered walking these same halls once, laughing at something Draven had said, feeling utterly certain that her future belonged within these walls. That certainty had shattered so completely that she barely recognized the woman who once believed it. Garrick led her into a private study, sunlight streaming through tall windows, shelves lined with books and maps, and there, standing near the window with his back to the door, was Draven. He turned as they entered, and Alara forced herself to keep her head slightly bowed, her eyes fixed on the floor just ahead of her feet, though every instinct screamed at her to look at him fully, to memorize a face she had once known better than her own. "Thank you, Garrick," Draven said. "You may leave us." Garrick hesitated only briefly, before nodding and stepping out, closing the heavy wooden door behind him, leaving Alara alone in a room, with the man she had spent 3 years avoiding. "The garment," Draven said, gesturing toward a folded cloak resting on a nearby table, "belonged to my father. It was damaged during a training exercise years ago, and I have never had the heart to have it repaired by anyone else, until now." Alara approached the table carefully, grateful for the excuse to focus on something other than the man standing only a few paces away. She lifted the cloak, examining the torn seam along the shoulder, and felt a strange pang of recognition. She remembered this cloak. She remembered Draven wearing it once, telling her stories about his father, about the weight of the legacy he would one day inherit. "I can repair this," she said, keeping her voice steady despite the memories threatening to overwhelm her. It will take a few hours of careful work. Take whatever time you need, Draven said, and something in his tone made her glance up, just briefly, just long enough to see him watching her with an intensity that made her stomach twist with fear. Is something wrong, my king? She asked, immediately regretting the question, wishing she could pull the words back the moment they left her mouth. Draven shook his head slowly, though his eyes remained fixed on her, studying her with an expression she could not quite read. Forgive me. You remind me of someone. I cannot quite place who, but the feeling has followed me since I first saw you in the market. Elara's heart nearly stopped. She forced herself to look back down at the cloak in her hands, focusing on threading her needle, her fingers trembling so badly that she nearly pricked herself. I have a common face, my king, she said carefully. Perhaps you are simply mistaken. Perhaps, Draven said, though he did not sound entirely convinced. He moved to a nearby chair and sat, watching her work in silence for several long moments, and Elara felt the weight of his gaze, like a physical pressure against her skin. May I ask you something personal, he said eventually. Every muscle in Elara's body tensed. You may ask, my king, though I cannot promise a satisfying answer. Why do you cover your face? The question hung in the air between them, and Elara took her time responding, using the excuse of her work to buy herself precious seconds to construct an answer that would satisfy his curiosity, without revealing anything true. A personal choice, my king, she said finally. Some wear it as protection, others as habit. I find it easier to move through the world unnoticed. That seems a difficult way to live, Draven said quietly, hiding yourself from everyone around you. Sometimes hiding is safer than being seen, Elara replied, and the words carried more weight than she intended, more truth than she meant to reveal. Draven fell silent again, and when Elara risked another glance in his direction, she found him studying her with an expression that looked almost pained, as though her words had struck something deep and unresolved within him. I understand that feeling more than you might expect, he said eventually. There are parts of my own past that feel hidden from me, though not by choice. Certain memories, certain months of my life, feel like they belong to someone else entirely. I have never told anyone this. Elara's needle stilled completely. She stared at the fabric in her lap, her mind racing, trying to make sense of what he had just admitted. Missing memories, months that felt hidden. Could it be possible that Draven's rejection of her 3 years ago had not been entirely his own choice? Could there be some explanation she had never considered, buried beneath whatever fog now clouded his recollection of that time? She wanted desperately to ask him more, to press for details that might explain the gaps in his memory, but doing so would risk revealing far more about herself than she could afford. She forced herself to remain silent, to focus on her sewing, though her mind churned with new questions she had never before considered. I apologize, Draven said after a long pause, seeming to shake himself out of whatever thoughts had claimed him. I do not know why I shared that with you. You are a stranger, and yet something about your presence makes me feel as though I can speak freely, which I rarely allow myself to do. There is nothing to apologize for, my king, Elara said softly, and she meant it more than he could possibly understand. She finished the repair in silence after that, the air between them charged with unspoken questions, neither of them dared voice aloud. When she finally handed the mended cloak back to him, their fingers brushed briefly, and Elara felt a jolt of familiarity so powerful that she nearly gasped aloud. Draven's eyes widened slightly, as though he had felt something too, though he quickly composed himself, examining the repaired scene with careful attention. This is excellent work, he said. Better than I expected. I would like you to continue working for the palace, if you are willing. There is always mending to be done, and I find myself curious to speak with you further, if that would not trouble you. Every rational part of Elara's mind screamed that this arrangement was dangerous, that continued proximity to Draven would only increase the risk of discovery, that she should decline politely and disappear back into the anonymity of the market square as quickly as possible. But some other part of her, a part she had tried desperately to silence for 3 years, ached at the thought of walking away from him again, of losing this fragile, unexpected connection, before she had even begun to understand what it might mean. I would be honored, my king, she heard herself say, though her voice trembled slightly with the weight of the decision. Wonderful, Draven said, and for the first time since she had entered the room, Something like a genuine smile crossed his face, brief and unguarded, and Ilara felt her chest tighten with an emotion she had spent 3 years trying to bury. She left the palace that afternoon with new instructions to return twice a week for palace mending work, her mind spinning with the implications of what had just happened. She had walked into that study determined to remain a stranger to him, and had left instead having agreed to spend regular time in his presence, drawn by a pull she could not fully explain or resist. As she made her way back through the market square, she caught sight of a figure watching her from beneath the shadow of a merchant's awning, a man she did not recognize, his gaze following her with an intensity that made her skin prickle with unease. She quickened her pace, telling herself it was simply her nerves, still frayed from the tense meeting with Draven, but the feeling of being watched followed her all the way home, and she could not shake the sense that the danger from the night before had not truly passed at all. It had only just begun to circle closer. 3 years earlier, before the veil, before the silence, Ilara had been known throughout the territory simply as the healer's daughter, a young woman with a gift for herbal medicine and an unguarded laugh that seemed to brighten every room she entered. She had met Draven during a training exercise gone wrong, when a young wolf had been badly injured near the healer's cottage where she lived, and worked alongside her mother. Draven, not yet crowned as Alpha King, but already respected as the future leader of the pack, had carried the injured wolf to their door himself, refusing to leave until he was certain the young warrior would recover. Ilara had tended the wound with careful, practiced hands, while Draven watched, and when the crisis passed, he had lingered, asking questions about her work, her knowledge of healing herbs, her life within the pack. That conversation stretched into hours, and those hours stretched into weeks of secret meetings, stolen moments in the forest beyond the healer's cottage, quiet conversations beneath the stars, that gradually became something neither of them could deny any longer. Draven had never felt so completely understood by anyone before Ilara. She did not care about his title or his future crown. She cared about the man beneath the responsibility, the person who sometimes doubted himself, who carried the weight of his father's expectations like a stone around his neck. With her, he could set that weight down, if only for a few stolen hours at a time. Ilara, in turn, had never imagined that someone destined for such power could make her feel so completely seen, so utterly cherished, as though her opinions and her dreams mattered as much as any political alliance his advisors might have preferred for him. They had planned to announce their bond during the autumn gathering, a tradition that would formally recognize their connection before the entire pack. Ilara remembered the excitement of those final weeks, choosing fabric for a ceremonial dress, practicing the words she would speak before the assembled pack, imagining a future that felt, for the first time in her life, entirely within reach. Then, 3 days before the gathering, everything changed. She had been summoned to the palace unexpectedly, told that Draven wished to speak with her privately before the ceremony. She arrived full of hope, imagining perhaps a final surprise, some small gesture to mark their upcoming bond. Instead, she found Draven surrounded by his father's oldest advisors, his expression distant and guarded in a way she had never seen before, as though a stranger had taken up residence behind his familiar eyes. "This bond cannot proceed," he had said, his voice flat and cold, utterly unlike the warm, teasing tone she had grown to love over the past months. "You are not suited to stand beside an Alpha King. Your bloodline holds no political value, and I have been made to understand the danger this connection poses to the stability of our territory." Ilara remembered the way the words had struck her like physical blows, each one landing with devastating precision. She remembered searching his eyes for some sign of the man she loved, some flicker of doubt or regret, but finding only cold, unyielding distance, as though he had already decided she meant nothing to him at all. She had not cried in front of him. She had held herself together through sheer force of will, nodded once, and walked out of the palace with her head held high, refusing to give his advisors the satisfaction of watching her fall apart. But once she reached the privacy of the forest beyond the palace walls, the grief had overwhelmed her completely, and she had wept until she had no tears left, until the sun set and rose again, until she finally understood that the future she had imagined no longer existed. She left the territory that same week, unable to bear the thought of remaining somewhere she might catch even a glimpse of him, might hear whispers of whatever political match his advisors eventually arranged in her place. She spent 6 months wandering between smaller settlements, working odd jobs, sleeping in whatever shelter she could find, slowly rebuilding herself from the wreckage of her broken heart. But every settlement she visited felt temporary, unsafe, vulnerable to the dangers that preyed on lone travelers without pack protection. Eventually, practicality forced her hand. She needed the safety that came with living under a strong alpha's protection, needed steady work and reliable shelter, and despite everything, Draven's territory remained the largest and most secure in the region. Returning felt like an impossible contradiction, but staying away indefinitely felt equally impossible. So she had returned, transformed. She cut her hair, changed her name, adopted a rougher, lower voice, and most importantly, began wearing the veil that would ensure Draven never recognized her if their paths happened to cross. She told herself the veil was purely practical, a tool for survival, nothing more. She refused to admit, even to herself, that some small part of her also wore it as protection against the unbearable pain of seeing recognition, or worse, indifference, in his eyes. For 3 years, the arrangement had worked exactly as she intended. She lived quietly, worked steadily, and avoided any situation that might bring her into close contact with the man who had once promised her a future, and then taken it away without explanation. Now, sitting alone in her small home after her visit to the palace, Elara found herself replaying his words from that afternoon, about missing memories, about months of his life that felt hidden from him. Could it be possible that the cold, distant man who had rejected her 3 years ago had not been entirely himself? Could someone, or something, have influenced his decision in ways neither of them had understood at the time? The thought terrified her more than she expected, because if it were true, it meant the pain she had carried for 3 years had been built on a foundation she had never fully understood. It meant the man she loved might not have chosen to break her heart at all, and that possibility opened a door she had spent 3 years desperately trying to keep closed. She pressed her palms against her eyes, willing herself not to hope, because hope felt far more dangerous than grief ever had. Grief, at least, she had learned to survive. Hope, if it proved false again, might finally break her completely. Outside her window, the city settled into evening once more, and somewhere beyond the rooftops, inside the palace she had just left, Draven sat alone in his study, staring at the mended cloak draped across his lap, wondering why the seamstress's touch had felt so achingly familiar, and why, for the first time in 3 years, the fog surrounding his missing memories seemed to be thinning, just slightly, at the edges. Over the following weeks, Elara's visits to the palace became a regular part of her life, twice each week, sometimes 3 times, when urgent mending arose among the royal guard or the household staff. She told herself repeatedly that these visits meant nothing beyond practical necessity, that she could maintain her disguise indefinitely as long as she remained careful, but with each visit, maintaining that careful distance grew more difficult. Draven began finding small excuses to extend their time together. A torn sleeve that required her opinion on the best repair method, a question about a particular stitching technique he claimed to find fascinating, though Elara suspected his interest had little to do with fabric at all. A cup of tea offered during a break in her work, accompanied by quiet conversation about nothing in particular, the kind of easy, comfortable exchange that reminded her painfully of the months they had spent together 3 years earlier. She noticed the way his shoulders relaxed slightly whenever she entered a room, the tension of ruling a kingdom easing, even briefly, in her presence. She noticed the way he sometimes watched her with an expression of quiet confusion, as though searching for something just out of reach, something he could sense but not quite name. For her part, Elara found herself looking forward to these visits with a hunger she despised in herself. She told herself repeatedly that she was simply grateful for steady, well-paying work, that the palace's warm study offered a pleasant break from the cramped confines of her small home, that any comfort she felt in Draven's presence was purely coincidental and meaningless. She knew these were lies, but she told them to herself anyway, because the alternative, admitting that 3 years of careful healing had not erased her feelings for this man at all, felt far too dangerous to acknowledge. One afternoon, as she worked on repairing a set of ceremonial banners in the palace's grand hall, Draven appeared unexpectedly, settling into a nearby chair with a stack of papers he claimed required his attention, though Elara noticed he spent far more time watching her work then reading whatever documents he had brought along. "May I ask you something?" he said eventually, setting the papers aside entirely. "Of course, my king. Do you have family in this territory? People who know you well?" Alara's hands stilled briefly over her work before she forced them to continue. "No family remains, my king. I live alone." "That sounds lonely," Draven said, and something in his tone carried genuine concern rather than idle curiosity. "I have grown accustomed to it," Alara replied, keeping her voice carefully neutral. "I understand loneliness better than most people realize," Draven said quietly. "Ruling a kingdom means very few people ever see past the crown to the person beneath it. Sometimes I wonder if anyone truly knows me at all anymore." Alara's chest tightened painfully at his words. She had known him, once, completely and without pretense. She had seen the man beneath the crown, had loved him without any concern for his title or his power. The urge to tell him this, to remind him that someone had once understood him fully, pressed against her chest like a physical weight. But she forced the words back down, terrified of what admitting even a fraction of the truth might unleash. "Perhaps those who truly know you simply need the courage to speak plainly," she said carefully, choosing her words with deliberate ambiguity. Draven studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "Perhaps you are right," he said finally, "though courage seems harder to find than most people admit." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a palace attendant carrying urgent news, and Draven excused himself quickly, leaving Alara alone with her banners and her racing thoughts, wondering how much longer she could continue walking this dangerous line between honesty and deception, without eventually losing her footing entirely. That evening, as she packed her sewing supplies to leave, she encountered a woman she did not recognize, standing near the palace's western courtyard, watching her with sharp, assessing eyes. The woman wore fine clothing that marked her as someone of considerable status, her posture rigid and confident, in a way that immediately put Alara on guard. "You are the seamstress the king has taken such interest in," the woman said, her tone carrying an edge of thinly veiled hostility. "I am Talia, betrothed to the king, through an arrangement negotiated by our respective families." Alara's stomach dropped. She had not known about any betrothal, had never heard Draven mention such an arrangement during their many conversations, but the confidence in Talia's voice suggested this was no idle claim. "I am simply here for palace mending work, my lady," Alara said carefully, bowing her head slightly in deference. "See that it remains simple," Talia said, her voice dropping lower, colder. "The king has been distracted lately, spending far more time in this study than his duties require, and I have noticed the pattern coincides precisely with your visits. I do not know what game you think you are playing, seamstress, but I suggest you abandon it quickly, before I take steps to ensure you cannot continue it at all." The threat hung clearly in the air between them, and Alara felt a chill spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the evening air. She had known, somewhere in the back of her mind, that continued closeness with Draven carried risks beyond simple discovery of her true identity. Now she understood that those risks extended to powerful people, willing to protect their own interests by whatever means necessary. "I have no interest in games, my lady," Alara said, keeping her voice steady despite the fear coiling tight in her stomach. "I am merely a seamstress performing my work." Talia's eyes narrowed, studying Alara's veiled face with an intensity that made her skin prickle with unease. "There is something strange about you," she said slowly. "Something I cannot quite place. I intend to find out exactly what it is." She turned and walked away without another word, leaving Alara standing alone in the darkening courtyard, her heart pounding with a fear that felt entirely different from anything she had experienced since returning to the territory 3 years earlier. The danger she had sensed since the night the rogue guard attacked her had not disappeared at all. It had simply shifted shape, transforming from a stranger's blade into something far more dangerous. A powerful woman, with every incentive to expose Alara's secret, and every resource necessary to accomplish exactly that. Alara walked home that night, through streets that suddenly felt far less safe than they had that morning, glancing repeatedly over her shoulder, certain that someone was watching her every move, though she saw no one following her directly. She did not know that Talia had already begun quietly investigating the mysterious seamstress, sending trusted contacts to dig through records, to question anyone who might remember details about a veiled woman who had appeared in the territory precisely 3 years earlier, around the exact time rumors had swirled briefly about a broken bond involving the young Alpha King before he ascended fully to his crown. The threads connecting Alara's careful secret to the truth Draven had spent 3 years unknowingly searching for were beginning to draw closer together, pulled by forces neither of them could fully control, and the careful world Alara had built around herself was about to be tested in ways she had never anticipated. Talia did not waste time once she decided to pursue the truth about the veiled seamstress. Within days, she had summoned a man named Callum, the very same merchant who had originally paid the rogue guard to investigate Alara, having learned of his existence through careful questioning of palace staff, who remembered the earlier incident. "You were paid to investigate a woman named Alara," Talia said, meeting Callum in a private room, away from palace eyes, her voice sharp and businesslike. "I want to know everything you discovered before your associate was arrested." Callum, a thin man with calculating eyes, studied Talia carefully before responding. "My associate discovered very little before his arrest, my lady. Only that the woman keeps almost entirely to herself, has no known family in this territory, and arrived here approximately 3 years ago under circumstances nobody seems able to fully explain." 3 years ago, Talia repeated, something clicking into place in her mind. Around the same time the young Alpha King's betrothal negotiations first began. After that strange incident everyone still whispers about, but nobody discusses openly. "I could not say, my lady," Callum replied carefully. "Though I would be willing to continue my investigation, for the right price." Talia agreed immediately, providing Callum with resources and instructions to dig deeper, to search for any record of Alara's arrival in the territory, any witness who might remember details from those first uncertain weeks after her return. Meanwhile, inside the palace, Draven found himself increasingly consumed by thoughts of the mysterious seamstress, unable to shake the persistent feeling that she held answers to questions he had been unable to fully articulate even to himself. He began reviewing old palace records, searching for any mention of the missing months in his memory, any documentation from his advisors that might explain the gaps he could not fill on his own. He found nothing conclusive, but he did find something unsettling. A brief notation in his father's old journal, dated approximately 3 years earlier, mentioning a decision made regarding his son's future bond, followed by a cryptic reference to ensuring the young Alpha's judgment remained clear and unclouded during a critical political period. The words unsettled him deeply. Clear and unclouded judgment implied that his judgment had, at some point, been considered unclear or clouded, requiring intervention of some kind. He had no memory of any such intervention, no recollection of anything beyond a vague sense that something important had happened during that period, something he could not fully access no matter how hard he tried. He brought the journal entry to Garrick, the only person within the palace he trusted enough to discuss such sensitive matters. "Did my father ever mention anything about protecting my judgment during a difficult political period?" Draven asked, showing Garrick the brief notation. Garrick's expression flickered with something Draven could not quite read, a brief hesitation that immediately caught his attention. "My king, there were rumors, many years ago, about a healer employed by your father, someone skilled in certain herbal remedies that could influence memory and emotion under extreme circumstances. I never had direct knowledge of such things being used, but the rumors persisted for years among the older guards." Draven felt something cold settle in his chest. "Are you suggesting my own father may have altered my memories?" "I am suggesting nothing definitively, my king," Garrick said carefully. "Only that such rumors existed, and that the timing you describe aligns roughly with certain events from that period, events your father never fully explained even to his closest advisors." Draven sat in silence for a long moment, processing the implications of what Garrick had just revealed. If his father had indeed used some form of herbal intervention to influence his judgment during that critical period 3 years ago, it meant his decisions during that time, including whatever decision had left him with an unexplained ache and persistent fragments of missing memory, might not have been entirely his own. It meant something, or someone, important had likely been taken from him deliberately, and he had spent 3 years unknowingly mourning a loss he could not even properly remember. "Find out everything you can," Draven said finally, his voice tight with restrained emotion. "I need to know what happened during that period, and I need to know now." Garrick nodded and departed immediately, leaving Draven alone, with a growing certainty that the seamstress who had captured his attention so completely held some connection to the missing pieces of his past, though he still could not fully understand how or why. He did not know that across the city, in a private room hidden from palace eyes, Talia and Callum were pursuing the very same truth from an entirely different direction, driven not by a desire to heal old wounds, but by a determination to eliminate any threat to Talia's carefully arranged betrothal, regardless of the cost to anyone caught in between. Ilara, unaware of either investigation unfolding around her, continued her careful routine, visiting the palace twice weekly, maintaining her disguise with the same practiced precision she had relied upon for 3 years. But she noticed small changes she could not fully explain: guards watching her slightly longer than necessary as she passed, whispered conversations that stopped abruptly when she came within earshot, an atmosphere of tension that seemed to follow her through every corridor she walked. She told herself these observations were simply the product of an anxious mind, the natural result of maintaining a secret for so many years finally beginning to wear on her nerves. But deep down, she knew something had shifted, some careful balance disturbed, and she could not shake the growing certainty that her carefully constructed world was approaching a breaking point she would soon be unable to avoid. During her next visit to the palace, she found Draven waiting for her in his study, with an intensity in his expression that immediately set her nerves on edge. "I need to ask you something important," he said, gesturing for her to sit in the chair across from his desk, rather than beginning her usual mending work immediately. "And I need you to answer honestly, whatever the answer might be." Ilara's heart pounded painfully against her ribs as she lowered herself into the offered chair, bracing herself for whatever question he intended to ask, terrified that the careful world she had built around herself was finally, irrevocably, about to collapse. "Have we met before?" Draven asked, watching her closely from across his desk. "Before I first saw you in the market square, I mean. Something about you feels deeply familiar, and I cannot shake the feeling no matter how hard I try to dismiss it." Ilara forced herself to remain perfectly still, drawing on every ounce of composure she had cultivated over 3 careful years. "I do not believe we have met, my king. I have lived quietly in the lower quarter since arriving in this territory. My life has never crossed paths with royalty before now." "When exactly did you arrive?" Draven pressed, leaning forward slightly, his gaze intense enough that Ilara had to fight the urge to look away entirely. "Some years ago," she said carefully, deliberately vague. "I do not keep close track of such things." "3 years?" Draven asked, and something in his tone told her he already suspected the answer. Ilara's breath caught. "Perhaps, I could not say with certainty." Draven studied her for a long moment, and Ilara felt the weight of his attention like a physical pressure, threatening to crack the careful mask she had maintained for so long. She watched something shift behind his eyes, a flicker of something that looked almost like recognition, quickly suppressed and pushed aside, as though he could not quite allow himself to trust whatever instinct had briefly surfaced. "Forgive me," he said finally, sitting back in his chair. "I have been consumed lately by questions about my own past that I cannot fully answer, and I find myself searching for connections in places where perhaps none exist. You remind me of someone I lost, though I cannot even properly remember the details of that loss, which I understand sounds strange coming from an Alpha King who is meant to command certainty in all things." "It does not sound strange to me, my king," Ilara said softly, her voice thick with emotions she could not fully hide. "Grief has a way of clouding memory, even when we wish desperately to remember clearly." "Is that wisdom born from experience?" Draven asked, watching her carefully. Ilara hesitated, aware that she stood on the edge of revealing far more than she intended. "Everyone carries some grief, my king. Mine is simply my own." Before Draven could press further, a sharp knock interrupted their conversation, and Garrick entered without waiting for permission, his expression grave and urgent. "My king, forgive the interruption, but this cannot wait. We have discovered something regarding the matter we discussed earlier, and I believe you need to see it immediately." Draven rose reluctantly, glancing back at Ilara with an expression of genuine regret. "We will continue this conversation soon," he said. "I have not finished asking my questions." Ilara nodded silently, watching him leave with Garrick, her heart still hammering violently against her ribs. The moment the door closed behind them, She allowed herself to release a shaking breath, pressing a trembling hand against her chest, as though she could physically steady the frantic rhythm of her heartbeat. She knew, with growing certainty, that she could not continue this arrangement much longer. Every visit brought her closer to discovery. Every conversation chipped away at the careful walls she had built around her secret, and she did not know how much longer she could maintain the disguise before it finally shattered entirely. She gathered her sewing supplies and left the palace quickly, choosing not to wait for Draven's return, desperate to put distance between herself and the study where his questions had come dangerously close to unraveling everything. As she crossed the palace's western courtyard, hurrying toward the main gate, a sudden gust of wind swept through the enclosed space, catching the loose edge of her veil and tugging it upward with unexpected force. Elara gasped, grabbing frantically at the fabric, but not before it lifted enough to reveal the lower half of her face for one terrifying, exposed moment. Across the courtyard, Talia stood watching, having just emerged from a private meeting with Callum, and her sharp eyes caught the brief glimpse of Elara's unveiled face before the seamstress managed to yank the fabric back into place, her hands trembling violently as she retied the knot with clumsy, desperate fingers. Talia's expression shifted into something calculating and cold, and Elara knew instantly, with sickening certainty, that she had seen enough. "Wait," Talia called out, striding across the courtyard with purposeful steps. "I want a closer look at you, seamstress." Elara's instincts screamed at her to run, but running would only confirm whatever suspicions Talia had just formed, would only draw more attention to a situation already spiraling dangerously out of control. She forced herself to stop, to turn and face Talia with as much composure as she could muster despite her racing heart. "My lady," she said carefully, keeping her voice low and rough, "I apologize for any disturbance. The wind simply caught my veil." "How convenient," Talia said, her eyes narrowed with suspicion as she studied Elara's face, still partially concealed, but no longer as thoroughly hidden as before. "You know, I have been making inquiries about you. Interesting things keep surfacing. A woman who arrived in this territory precisely 3 years ago, around the same time certain unfortunate rumors circulated about the young Alpha King's broken betrothal, before he ascended fully to his crown. A woman who covers her face so thoroughly that nobody has seen her true features in all the years she has lived here. I find myself wondering, seamstress, whether these facts might be connected in ways that would interest the king greatly." Elara's blood ran cold. "I do not know what you are suggesting, my lady." "I think you know exactly what I am suggesting," Talia said, her voice dropping lower, more dangerous. "And I think you should consider very carefully what happens next. I could expose whatever secret you are hiding right now, in this courtyard, before anyone who might overhear. Or you could disappear quietly, tonight, and never return to this territory again. Choose wisely, seamstress, because I do not offer second chances." Elara stood frozen, torn between two impossible choices, each one threatening to destroy the fragile life she had built, and the fragile, unexpected connection she had begun rebuilding with Draven, despite every effort to prevent it. Before she could respond, footsteps echoed across the courtyard, and both women turned to find Draven himself approaching, his expression sharp with concern as he took in the tense scene before him. "What is happening here?" he demanded, his gaze moving between Talia's cold, calculating expression and Elara's visible distress, his instincts immediately alerting him that something significant had just occurred, something he had clearly interrupted before it could reach its conclusion. Neither woman spoke immediately, the silence stretching taut and dangerous between them, and Elara realized with mounting horror that whatever happened in the next few moments would determine the entire course of her carefully hidden future. "Nothing of importance, my king," Talia said smoothly, recovering her composure with practiced ease. "Simply a minor disagreement regarding the quality of some recent mending work. Nothing worth troubling yourself over." Draven's eyes narrowed slightly, clearly unconvinced, but he did not press the matter immediately, instead turning his attention to Elara, whose distress remained visible despite her attempts to compose herself. "Are you well?" he asked, his voice softening with genuine concern that made Talia's expression tighten with barely concealed irritation. "I am well, my king," Elara said quietly, though her voice trembled slightly. "I should return home. The hour grows late." "Of course," Draven said, though he continued watching her with obvious concern, as she gathered her belongings and made her way toward the gate, glancing back once to find Talia's cold gaze fixed on her with unmistakable warning. Elara did not sleep at all that night, her mind racing through every possible consequence of Talia's threat. She understood clearly that she faced an impossible decision. She could disappear, as Talia demanded, abandoning the territory entirely and beginning yet another difficult journey toward an uncertain future in unfamiliar lands. Or she could remain, risking exposure not only to Draven but to the entire pack, uncertain what consequences might follow once the truth of her identity became known. She thought of the strange revelations Draven had shared with her, about missing memories, about months of his life that felt hidden from him, about a decision made regarding his future bond that he could not fully recall making himself. She thought about the possibility, however small, that the rejection which had shattered her life 3 years ago had not been entirely his own choice, that some external influence had shaped his judgment during that critical period. If that possibility held any truth, then disappearing now, without ever learning the full story, without ever giving Draven the chance to understand what had truly happened between them, felt like abandoning something precious before it could be properly resolved. By morning, Elara had made her decision. She would not run. She had run once before, 3 years ago, and the running had brought her nothing but years of loneliness and careful hiding. This time, she would face whatever consequences awaited her directly, on her own terms, rather than allowing Talia's threats to dictate her future once again. She arrived at the palace for her scheduled visit that afternoon, her heart pounding but her resolve firm, only to find Garrick waiting for her at the eastern gate with an expression far more serious than usual. "The king requests your presence in the grand hall," Garrick said, his tone carrying an edge Elara could not quite interpret. "He has summoned several members of his court for an important announcement." Elara's stomach twisted with dread as she followed Garrick through the palace corridors, her mind racing with possibilities, none of them reassuring. Had Talia already spoken to Draven? Had she revealed whatever suspicions she harbored, forcing this public confrontation before Elara had time to prepare herself properly? The grand hall was already filled with palace nobility and senior guards when Elara arrived, a formal gathering unlike anything she had witnessed during her previous visits. Draven stood at the front of the room, dressed in formal attire that marked the seriousness of the occasion, his expression unreadable as Elara entered and took a position near the back of the assembled crowd. Talia stood near the front as well, her posture rigid and confident, and Elara felt a fresh wave of fear wash over her at the sight of the other woman's satisfied expression. "I have called this gathering," Draven began, his voice carrying clearly through the silent hall, "to address a matter that has weighed heavily on my mind for some time. 3 years ago, I made a decision regarding a personal bond that I have long believed was made freely, of my own judgment and will. Recent discoveries have led me to question that belief." A murmur rippled through the assembled crowd, and Elara's heart began pounding so violently she feared everyone around her could hear it. "My father, before his passing, employed certain methods to influence my judgment during a critical political period," Draven continued, his voice tight with barely restrained emotion. "I have since learned that a healer in his employment administered herbal remedies, capable of altering memory and emotional clarity, used specifically to ensure I would accept a political arrangement my father believed necessary, despite my own genuine feelings at the time." The hall fell into stunned silence, and Draven's gaze swept across the assembled crowd before settling, finally and unmistakably, on Elara, standing frozen near the back of the room. "3 years ago, I broke a promised bond with a woman I loved completely," he said, his voice carrying a raw vulnerability that Elara had never heard from him before, not even in their most private conversations. "I have spent 3 years unable to fully understand why, carrying an ache I could not properly explain, mourning a loss I could not clearly remember. I now believe that decision was not entirely my own, that my judgment was deliberately clouded to serve a political purpose I never willingly chose." He paused, and the silence in the hall stretched taut and heavy, every eye fixed on him as he continued. "I have spent recent weeks in the company of a seamstress who covers her face, who arrived in this territory precisely 3 years ago, whose presence stirs memories I cannot fully access, but feel with an intensity I cannot ignore." His gaze remained fixed on Elara as he spoke, and she felt the full weight of his attention like a physical force, holding her in place despite every instinct urging her to flee. I believe, with growing certainty, that this woman may be far more important to my past than either of us has been willing to acknowledge. Talia's face had drained of color, her earlier confidence crumbling visibly as the implications of Draven's words settled over the room. Alara stood frozen, her heart pounding so violently she felt certain she might collapse, unable to move, unable to speak, caught entirely in the moment she had spent 3 years desperately trying to avoid. Draven crossed the hall slowly, deliberately, until he stood directly before her, close enough that she could see the raw uncertainty and hope warring in his expression. "I am asking you, before everyone gathered here, to tell me the truth," he said quietly, his voice meant only for her, despite the silent hall listening to every word. "I believe I already know the answer, though I cannot explain how or why. I simply need to hear it from you directly." Alara's hands trembled as she reached toward the knot securing her veil. 3 years of careful hiding, culminating in this single, terrifying moment, and she understood with complete certainty that whatever happened next would determine the entire course of the rest of her life. Alara's fingers stilled against the knot of her veil, her entire body trembling with a fear so complete it felt as though her legs might give way beneath her. The entire hall waited in absolute silence, every eye fixed on the two of them, and she understood that there was no possible way to avoid this moment any longer. "May I?" Draven asked softly, his hand raised slightly, not yet touching her, waiting for her permission, with a gentleness that undid something deep within her chest. Alara closed her eyes briefly, 3 years of carefully constructed distance collapsing in an instant, and finally, slowly, she nodded. Draven reached forward with careful, deliberate hands and untied the knot securing her veil, letting the gray fabric fall away completely, revealing her face fully, for the first time in 3 years, to anyone beyond the privacy of her own small home. A collective gasp rippled through the assembled crowd as recognition dawned across the hall, whispers erupting immediately, as older members of the court remembered a face few had seen in years, a face connected to rumors that had circulated quietly for so long that most had assumed the woman in question had left the territory forever. Draven stood frozen before her, his eyes moving across her features with an expression of dawning, overwhelming recognition. 3 years of fog and confusion, finally clearing all at once, memories flooding back with a force that visibly staggered him. "Alara," he breathed, her name carrying decades of longing, compressed into a single, broken syllable. "It was you. All along, it was you." Tears filled Alara's eyes as she watched understanding transform his expression completely, watched 3 years of unexplained grief finally find its proper shape and meaning. "Draven," she said softly, her voice breaking on his name, the first time she had spoken it aloud to his face in 3 long years. "I remember now," he said, his voice thick with emotion, as more memories continued surfacing, rapid and overwhelming. "I remember loving you completely. I remember the promise I made you, the future I imagined for us. I remember my father's advisors surrounding me, forcing something upon me that clouded my judgment, though I could never before recall the details clearly enough to understand what had truly happened. I did not know," Alara said, tears now falling freely down her face. "I believed you had simply chosen to reject me, that I had never truly mattered enough to fight for. I spent 3 years believing that. You mattered more than anything," Draven said fiercely, stepping closer, his hands rising to gently cup her face, as though he could not quite believe she stood before him after 3 years of unexplained loss. "I would never have chosen to let you go. Not freely, not if my own judgment had remained clear. Whatever influence my father used against me, it stole something precious from both of us, and I have spent 3 years feeling the absence of that loss, without ever understanding its true cause." Behind them, Talia had begun backing quietly toward the edge of the hall, her expression a mixture of fear and calculation, clearly recognizing that whatever plans she had built around her own betrothal to Draven were crumbling rapidly in the face of this unexpected revelation. "Stop her," Draven commanded, his voice carrying sharp authority, despite the raw emotion still evident in his expression, and 2 guards immediately moved to intercept Talia, before she could slip from the hall unnoticed. "I only wish to protect my own arranged future," Talia protested, as the guards restrained her gently but firmly. I did nothing beyond investigating suspicious circumstances that any reasonable person would have questioned." "You threatened her," Draven said, his voice cold with barely restrained anger, as he glanced toward Alara, who nodded slowly, confirming the accusation, without needing to speak the details aloud, in front of the entire assembled court. "You threatened to expose her, to force her from her home, purely to protect your own political ambitions. That is not protection, Talia. That is cruelty disguised as caution." Talia's confident facade finally crumbled entirely under the weight of the court's collective judgment, and Draven ordered her removed from the hall, the formal negotiations regarding her betrothal to be reconsidered entirely, in light of her actions, a political consequence that effectively ended whatever future she had once imagined for herself within his territory. Once the hall had settled, the guards escorting Talia away and the assembled nobility beginning to disperse into hushed, excited conversation, Draven turned his full attention back to Alara, his expression softening completely as he studied her unveiled face with an intensity that made her chest ache with 3 years of buried longing, finally allowed to surface. "I am so sorry," he said quietly, his thumb brushing gently against her cheek, wiping away the tears still falling freely. "I am sorry for every day you spent believing I had chosen to abandon you. I am sorry for every day you spent hiding, believing you needed protection from me, when in truth, I needed you to help me remember who I truly was." "You could not have known," Alara said softly, though the words carried less comfort than she intended. 3 years of pain still raw and present, despite the joy of this unexpected reunion. "I know that," Draven said, "but knowing does not erase the years we lost, years that were stolen from us by decisions neither of us truly made freely. I intend to spend whatever time is necessary, making amends for that loss, if you will allow me the chance." Alara studied his face carefully, searching for any remaining trace of the cold, distant stranger who had rejected her 3 years earlier, but found only the man she had loved completely, before everything fell apart, now standing before her with raw vulnerability and genuine remorse, offering her a future she had long ago believed impossible. "I would like that," she said finally, a small, tentative smile breaking through her tears, for the first time in longer than she could remember. "I would like that very much." In the weeks that followed, Draven ordered a thorough investigation into the herbal remedies his father had used to influence his judgment 3 years earlier, determined to understand fully how such an intervention had been possible, and to ensure nothing similar could ever be used against him or any future leader of the pack again. The investigation confirmed what Garrick had originally suspected, that the healer once employed by his father had indeed administered a rare herbal compound capable of dulling emotional clarity and altering short-term memory under extreme dosage, used specifically during the period surrounding Alara's rejected bond, to ensure Draven would accept his father's preferred political arrangement without the emotional resistance his genuine feelings would have otherwise produced. The revelation spread quickly throughout the pack, and rather than diminishing respect for their young Alpha King, it seemed instead to deepen the loyalty many felt toward him, understanding now the weight of manipulation he had unknowingly carried for years, and admiring the strength he showed in confronting that painful truth publicly, rather than hiding it away. Alara, for her part, found herself slowly adjusting to a life she had long ago stopped believing was possible. She continued her work as a seamstress initially, unwilling to abandon the skills and independence she had built for herself during her years of careful hiding, though she no longer needed the veil that had once defined her daily existence. The first time she walked through the market square with her face fully visible, sunlight warming her skin in a way it had not in 3 years, she felt an overwhelming mixture of vulnerability and freedom that brought fresh tears to her eyes. Familiar faces from the market greeted her with genuine warmth, several expressing quiet relief that the mysterious veiled seamstress they had grown fond of over the years had never actually been hiding anything shameful at all, simply protecting a heart that had been badly broken through no fault of her own. Draven visited her regularly during those early weeks, patient and unhurried despite the eagerness evident in his every gesture, understanding intuitively that rebuilding trust after 3 years of pain and separation required time and care rather than rushed declarations or hasty promises. They talked for hours during those visits, filling in the gaps of years spent apart, Alara sharing the difficult months of wandering before her return, Draven sharing the confusion and unexplained grief that had shadowed his rule, since the day his memory had been deliberately clouded. Slowly, carefully, the connection they had once shared began rebuilding itself, stronger in some ways than it had been 3 years earlier, tempered now by the hard-won understanding that came from surviving genuine loss and finding their way back to each other, despite circumstances designed specifically to keep them apart forever. 6 months after the revelation in the Grand Hall, Draven called together the entire pack for a formal gathering, much like the autumn celebration that had once been planned for their original bonding ceremony 3 years earlier. This time, no advisors stood ready to interrupt with political objections. No hidden herbal compounds clouded anyone's judgment, only genuine choice, freely made, witnessed by an entire community that had watched their story unfold with growing investment and hope. Elara stood before the assembled pack wearing a ceremonial dress in soft blue fabric, her face fully visible, sunlight catching in her hair as she recited the same words she had once practiced 3 years earlier, words that had waited patiently through years of pain and separation, to finally be spoken aloud, exactly as they were always meant to be. Draven's voice, when he spoke his own vows in return, carried none of the cold distance that had once shattered her world, only warmth and certainty, and a promise made with complete clarity of mind and heart, unclouded by anything beyond his own genuine feelings for the woman standing before him. As the pack erupted into celebration around them, Elara felt the weight of 3 difficult years finally lift from her shoulders entirely, replaced by a lightness she had nearly forgotten was possible. She thought of the veil that had protected her for so long, now folded away in a drawer in her small home, a reminder of survival rather than shame, proof that even the deepest wounds could eventually heal, given enough time, enough courage, and enough willingness to face difficult truths, rather than running from them forever. Draven pulled her close as the celebration continued around them, resting his forehead gently against hers, and Elara felt, for the first time in 3 years, completely and utterly safe. "No more hiding," he murmured softly, just for her to hear. "No more hiding," she agreed, and meant it completely, ready finally to step fully into the life and love that had always been meant for her, no longer separated by manipulation or fear, but bound together at last by nothing more complicated than genuine, unclouded choice. They ruled together in the years that followed, Elara eventually taking on responsibilities beyond her original work as a seamstress, using her gentle strength and quiet wisdom to support Draven through the complicated demands of leading their territory, while he in turn made certain she never again felt the need to hide any part of herself from the world around her. The story of the seamstress who wore a veil for 3 years, and the Alpha King who finally recognized her when he lifted it himself, became something the pack told for generations afterward, not as a tale of tragedy, but as proof that even when circumstances conspire to tear 2 hearts apart, genuine love, patient and enduring, has a way of finding its path back home again, no matter how long the journey takes or how carefully the truth has been hidden away.